Hi, friends. Here at Beyond the Crucible, we often get a chance to dive into some of the hardest moments of someone's life. Everything from facing loss to trying to find your purpose in life. This summer, we've been working extremely hard to pull together a full e-course, our first, filled with more than 3 hours of lessons learned on how you can find and fully embrace second act significance. To gain access to this course, visit secondactsignificance.com. That's secondactsignificance.com. Now, here's today's podcast episode. Well, welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast on which we discuss some of life's most devastating, challenging events and circumstances. We call them crucible experiences, and we talk about them to offer hope and healing that, as painful as they may be, they are not the end of your story. In fact, they can be the beginning of a new chapter of your story filled with purpose and, yes, with joy. You've joined us at the end, the last guest of our special fall series, Gaining from Loss. For these several weeks, we have been talking with individuals who've experienced trauma and tragedy, but have also embarked on journeys of hope and healing. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our host and guide is Warwick Fairfax, the founder of Beyond the Crucible, who has himself gained much from loss, which gives him both insights into and compassion for others who've walked a similar path or are walking that path now. It's been quite a ride, Warwick. This is our fifth episode of this series, and we have another guest who I know just from our conversations of some of the research we've done, you're quite impressed by and quite eager to get talking to, aren't you?
Absolutely. I can't think of the right word. Impressed feels like it does a disservice to Marisa's work, but a word that's beyond impressed, but yeah, very much looking forward to it.
Well, here is the reason, listener, why Warwick is impressed. Our guest is Marisa Renee Lee, and she is a called upon, I love that adjective. She's a called upon advocate, writer, and speaker on coping with grief. In 2008, she lost her mother to breast cancer. In 2019, Marisa and her husband lost a much wanted pregnancy. And most recently, she lost a young cousin to the COVID-19 pandemic. The losses transformed her life and led her to question what grief really is and what healing truly requires. As a leading grief advocate, Marisa offers incisive and compassionate advice on managing life after loss with unique insights for women and African American communities. Her first book, Grief is Love, Living with Loss, was published in April of 2022 under Hachette's new imprint, Legacy Lit, and it's already a national bestseller. As a former appointee in the Obama White House, Marisa previously served as the Deputy Director of Private Sector Engagement, a Senior Advisor on the Domestic Policy Council, and as the Managing Director of the MBK Alliance, the nonprofit born out of President Obama's call to action to address the barriers to success that boys and young men of color disproportionately face in their lives. That's why we use the word impressed. She's CEO of the social impact consulting firm Beacon Advisors, but Beacon Advisors. Lee is a public speaker and regular contributor to Glamour, Vogue, MSNBC, and The Atlantic. She's a graduate of Harvard College and lives in upstate New York with her husband, Matt, son, Bennett, and probably the one who thinks she runs the house, their dog, Sadie. Warwick, that is indeed an impressive resume, and I know you're very excited to have this conversation with Marisa, so take it away.
Well, Marisa, again, thank you so much for being here. I just loved reading your book, Grief is Love, which was full of just so much profound wisdom. Anybody that's had loss, which is so many people, it's just raw, it's honest, it's impactful, and we'll obviously get into this book quite a bit, but I'd love just to start from what I understand. You grew up in New York State, I think maybe upstate New York. Now you're in the Hudson Valley now, maybe that vicinity, I'm not sure. But talk a bit about, your upbringing and obviously your mom and dad. And before we get sort of to the loss, it's all intertwined. But what was life
Yes.
like for Marisa growing up?
Yeah, no, I love it. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's always a little embarrassing listening to your bio being read. I try not to cringe. But thank you. Thank you both for inviting me on today. Childhood, honestly, was pretty, I would say, ordinary and unremarkable. I had two parents who loved me very much and also loved each other, a little sister who drove me crazy, lots of friends. Both my parents were very active in my school life and in our community, from coaching basketball to serving on the PTA, being a Sunday school teacher. That was our life. Mom and dad both worked, but they were very clear that their work was all about providing the best possible life for me and my little sister. And it was really lovely and fun until one day everything changed. I was 13, and it was probably right around this time of year, actually. And one day my mom got really sick, and she just never got better. And it would take years and lots of misdiagnoses. But ultimately, by the time I was 16, doctors discovered permanent damage in her brain that was caused by multiple sclerosis. So it was a long journey to that diagnosis. And my life at home, our family life, went from a very carefree, fun, sort of average existence to one that was much more stressful and at times overwhelming and disorienting, with a parent who went from being very able bodied and active and involved to being disabled and in and out of the hospital and sometimes bedridden or in a wheelchair. So that was a really big challenge for me as a young person.
So, everybody grows up differently. I mean, some people grow up in an environment where they don't know happiness. They know tragedy, maybe dysfunctional family, just a, really hard upbringing. But it seems like there's two parts to your life. One is before age 13 and after age 13. Obviously, there's when your mother
Yeah.
died, when you're at 25, there's another separation in the timeline. But talk about, yeah, I mean, I don't know, at times, can you even remember what life was like pre-13? Because it just probably seems like a couple of centuries ago. But it felt like there was a time, as you say, when life, maybe not perfect, but was pretty good. And it went from
Yeah.
pretty good to, I don't know if it was
Yeah.
awful, but just really painful. It was just this
I would,
dichotomy.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's funny because in my mind, and I should talk to my dad about this. I don't know if this is actually exactly how it happened, but I remember my parents going to New York City for their wedding anniversary, and that's November 1st. And then I remember my mom soon after that becoming a different person and a different parent and a sick person. And I think the biggest thing that changed was, I went from this very carefree existence, and that's what childhood is supposed to be, right? To becoming like a mini adult overnight, it felt like. And I don't have any regrets for the time I spent as a teenager or a young adult helping to care for my mom and helping to care for our family. But it was a really big shift from what I knew before then. And it was hard. And it was also, the 90s. So nobody was talking to me about my feelings. Nobody was
Mm.
suggesting that, I go to therapy because it's complicated and challenging having a sick parent. It was more, okay, this is the situation and we're all going to do the best we can. And we love each other and we'll do what we can to support each other and just keep moving forward. That was my parents' attitude. That was my attitude, my sister's attitude. And that's what we did. But it was really hard.
So talk about that period when you have the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, and later on, obviously, breast cancer, and it felt like it just got worse. I mean, it didn't get easier.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
one major illness is enough, but more than, I mean, it's hard to understand. But just talk about those years, because it felt like you didn't have a normal childhood, normal high school or teenage years. You were sort of robbed in a sense of that. So probably one stage of grief is the person I thought I would be and the person my friends were, I wasn't. So talk about just, and I think you were like one of the primary caregivers. So just talk about those teenage years, which seems radically different than the teenage years of your friends, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it was, so it's interesting, in order to write a book that is at least partially based on your life experiences, you have to unpack a lot of shit. You really have to get at like, what is the truth? Like, what was I really feeling? What was I really experiencing then? And what do I feel now? And work through a lot of that. Like, Grief is Love required a lot of time in therapy. And one of the things that I realized as an adult was that there was definitely a feeling of resentment. Like, I didn't want to admit when I was younger how hard it was, or how burdensome it was, or how frustrating it was at times to have to play that role in my family and to have a sick parent, because the last thing that I wanted to do was make things harder for my mom, or frankly for my dad either. But like, in particular, I could see that she was in pain and still very much every single day trying to be a present, supportive parent to us. Like, it didn't matter how sick she was still going to find a way to get things together for our birthdays, to make sure that, Thanksgiving and Christmas were special, to let us have, whatever parties and gatherings we wanted to have with our friends when we were younger. Like, it didn't matter how much pain she was in or what she endured. Like, she continued to keep that focus on us. And as a result, like, I wanted to do everything I could to make her life easier. And so for me, that meant doubling down on, being best in class with academics and extracurriculars and everything at school, and trying to create as many normal teenage childhood experiences as possible, so she didn't feel like her illness was having a negative impact on me. And it was exhausting, and it had long-term health, mental and physical health implications for me. Not talking about all of these complicated feelings. When you ignore your emotions, they don't go away. They manifest in other ways. And so for me, from the time I was around 14, 15 until today, I'm almost 40 years old, like, I've had all sorts of stomach problems. And like, I know that it started with, mom gets sick with some mystery illness that nobody can figure out, and the stress that put on me as a 13-year-old. And so, I always say, whenever I have a chance to talk to people about my childhood and adolescence, I hope that young people like hear about Grief is Love and hear my story and find ways to get the support they need if they're struggling with either a sick parent or the loss of a parent, because it's really hard.
I like that you took the time to say that, because you said maybe 5 minutes ago in this conversation, you indicated in kind of a quick sort of float by way that you didn't, you had an unconventional childhood, but that you didn't regret taking care of your mom. And certainly you do not to this day regret it, but that you backed up and talked about getting to the point of truly embracing, not regretting. It took you some time, you some digging. I think that's a really important thing for listeners to understand, so that they don't just hear that first part and think, man, Marissa's a superhero. No. Yeah. I mean, Marisa did the work of perhaps a superhero to dig deep and find those things. And that's what we all have to do to get beyond the losses that we face. We've called this series Gaining from Loss. And for you to find the gains that were attached to that loss, those losses that you experienced. You had to do the soul work, is where it calls it, to get through and really dig in. And your book really helped you to do that.
Yeah, 100%. It was a really hard book to write. Like I said, there was a lot of therapy. There were a lot of tissues, and there was definitely like some chocolate and some bourbon involved. But at the end of the day, like, I feel like the process of putting Grief is Love together was absolutely a healing experience for me. And that is something that I'm grateful for. I don't know if I would have done all of this healing, all of this soul work, as you just called it, if not for the book.
I mean, that is profound. And I want to get to, the main loss of your mother and the book. But I think one of the things that you're saying is there was this dichotomy as you were dealing with the grief of your mother's illness. You were not letting it defeat you. You were being a strong young woman. You were kind of getting great grades. You would end up getting into Harvard College, which is obviously extremely impressive. And later on, as we've heard, you served in the Obama administration, worked in finance. I mean, you were not letting this defeat you. You were plowing through, pushing ahead, which is wonderful. It's an amazing thing. But yet at the same time, there was the other dichotomy of not letting yourself deal with the loss of the dream of who your mother was in your childhood. And you talk about this a lot in this book, about this misnomer that if I admit weakness or grief, I'm a weak person. Therefore, I'm a strong person. I will not let this define me or defeat me. I'm plowing ahead. So there was some good in the sense that it's great to be, from my perspective, driven to succeed, to achieve. I think that's wonderful. But there was the good and the bad. So talk about this almost yin-yang thing about as you were dealing with life.
I mean, I really believed that if I was honest about what I was feeling, that I would just be like taken down by these feelings and just end up in this super depressed and overwhelmed space that I would never come out of. So instead, I just tried to just bury them, just swallow them, shove them down and ignore them, which doesn't work. And in my case, manifested in both physical and, longer term mental health consequences. Like, I still struggle with anxiety from time to time. And I also bring that back to when my mom got sick and my childhood and my adolescence. And one of the things that I lift up in Grief is Love that I think is really important for people to understand, especially, overachievers who just want to keep like plowing through the hard things. The only thing that makes difficult and challenging emotions easier to deal with is acknowledgement. Like, naming our feelings is what reduces their power over us. And I think we often assume the reverse. And that's not just like me saying that. That is actual research on the brain and emotion and healing. So if you are going through it right now, whether it's grief or something similar, and you're like, oh, like I can't bring myself to even acknowledge it because that'll make it worse, that's actually what makes it a little bit better.
I want to comment on what you just said before we, just unpack for listeners a bit more of your mother's passing and then the impact it had on you. But I think listeners really need to hear what you're saying about acknowledging pain, loss, and just without getting too much into it, because this is about you, not me. In my own case, as listeners know, growing up in about as wealthy a privileged upbringing as it's possible to grow up in Australia, growing up in a 150-year-old family media business, which owned the equivalent of the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal of our country, very well-respected family by the community. We weren't like the media moguls who people love to hate. We were the ones who were respected by all sides of the political spectrum, produced honest papers that were impartial, of integrity. So then when I did my $2 billion takeover and didn't work right out, speaking of Harvard, right after Harvard Business School, having gone to Oxford previously, and it all failed, and I was like 30 when it all happened. I went through a few decades of loss in the sense of, look what I did. I'm such an idiot. How could I have done what I did? And there are reasons which I've talked about, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I've sort of learned you've got to talk about the loss, talk about the pain. I mean, I've had, close family members that, had a, I guess, somewhat significant adverse effect on me. Dealing with that, dealing with advisors who betrayed me. I used to feel like it was like, middle school, I'd have something on my back that said betray me. I mean, with lots of money comes betrayal. Yeah. All that's to say is the way I'm wired, and it's different than a lot of guys, is that I'm extremely reflective. So I have to understand, almost like name it, claim it. And I have to understand what it is. So I'm wired that way. So even before understanding modern mental health, I've been wired to not so much suck it up, but to understand. I'm married to my wife over 30 years, and we'll talk about it, and something will trigger me, some article, somewhere. Okay, I thought I was over this thing 30 plus years ago, but okay, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to head straight into the storm. So I don't know. I guess I'm blessed by my own inherent reflective wiring, which is not avoid it, is just head straight into it and deal with the feeling. So I don't take credit for that. I'm just blessed by the psyche that I have, which is a little different. But okay, back to you. I want to talk about, just so listeners fully understand this. So how old was your mother? How old were you when she passed? So just talk about that, because you were going through grieving up until that point, and you thought life was tough. It got exponentially tougher. The grief probably got exponentially worse after. And it probably 100%. Seemed pretty bad before. So just talk about what happened and the impact it had on you.
Yeah. So it's funny you asked the age piece, because I get really hung up on that. Because so when my mom first got sick, I was only 13. She was only 37. And as a almost 40-year-old, like, that feels crazy to me now. And then when she was diagnosed with the cancer, I was 22 and she would have been 42, which, like, is officially a peer, that's younger than my husband is now. And then when she passed away, I had just turned 25 and she had just turned 49. And so it's just like, it like blows my mind sometimes, thinking about how young she was when all of these things happened to her. But as I was graduating from college, my mom had been having a bad, probably let's call it 3 to 6 months, where she was in and out of the hospital a bunch, constantly going to the doctors. She's in a lot of pain, and she wasn't a complainer. So I knew that there was something wrong. My dad knew, my mom knew, like, we believed her, but a lot of doctors said that, basically they thought it was in her head. My grandmother had just passed away quite suddenly that fall, and folks thought that this was just kind of an emotional response that was manifesting in physical ways. She continued to seek out different doctors and support, and eventually ended up being seen by an orthopedic surgeon, like, thinking like there was something wrong with her bones, because nobody could figure it out. And the guy that she saw was actually also a family friend. So he was really listening to her and very committed to uncovering what was going on. And he found lesions on her spine. And he said, and I will never forget this, because I then saw him, at a friend's graduation party a few weeks later. He said that was the worst day in his entire career. Like, to be with someone that he, knew on some level, so knew that she'd already been sick for all of this time, and, had gotten the runaround from all of these other doctors. And he found cancer at the bones and had to tell her that on top of the MS. Like, he said it's a moment he will never forget. And so after the cancer was identified in her bones, we did follow-up appointments with oncologists and learned that it was stage 4 breast cancer that had migrated throughout her skeletal system. And this was the week I was graduating from Harvard. And so I went from, doctor's office in upstate New York back to Cambridge, did all of the end of school year, senior week fun festivities with this like cloud of grief and stress kind of hanging over my head. And then I decided to spend a year at home with my mom and dad, just kind of helping them figure out how to navigate this very complicated diagnosis or set of diagnoses and health situation. About 2.5, 3 years later, we took her off of treatment for both diseases because at that point, the cancer was in her brain. She was having problems with her lungs. Like her body had just had enough. And so we made the decision together as a family. And then a few weeks after we made the decision, we thought we had 6 months, a year, something like that. But 6 weeks later, we were hanging out in the living room. She was having a bad day, but she'd had so many bad days in the course of my life with her that it didn't register that like that day was going to be like the bad day, And she and I shared a joke, and then she collapsed and was gone a few hours later. And leading up to her death, again, my type A Harvard Wall Street brain was like, I'm going to make the spreadsheets. I got my list. Like, I'm going to do everything I can to prepare myself, to prepare her, our family, for her to die. And I thought that because I was so organized around her death, that would make the grief easier on the other side. And it just wasn't true. Like, it knocked me on my ass, and I didn't understand why. And I spent months berating myself for having so many feelings about an ordinary occurrence. We're all going to lose our parents someday, right? Like, that's what I would tell myself. Like, it's really not that big of a deal that your mom died. Just crazy. And it was awful until one day, and I don't know what shifted for me. Like, I wish I could remember it, but I honestly don't know. But it was one day, 6 months after she passed away, I wrote in my journal, like, there's nothing wrong with me. Like, where the problem sits is in how our culture treats people who are grieving, and like how we talk about and describe grief and loss. Because what you see on TV and in the movies where somebody dies, everybody puts on black and goes to the funeral, and then everybody goes back to life a few days or a week or so later, like, that's bullshit. That's not how it works. And so I wrote to myself, I said, I'm going to write a book about grief that's not going to be super sad and depressing, that will tell the truth about what grief really is, and that will be a New York Times bestseller. So we're still waiting on the New York Times, but I think I checked the other few boxes. Okay.
67% is good.
Right?
Yeah. No, you sure did. So talk about that. I mean, life was pretty tough beforehand, and you're, driven, Harvard, Wall Street, you got the spreadsheets, and people might think, and you write about this in the book, Marisa is she's, that strong Black woman. She's driven. She's like a role model for other women, maybe other Black women. She's doing it all. I mean, she is not letting anything defeat her. And there was this, I don't know if there was, a subconscious expectation within yourself, but on the one hand, you had this appearance of, boy, Marisa is intelligent, she's impressive, she's driven, she's somebody you admire. She is an amazing person, which is great for people to think that. That's not bad, right? That's awesome. But yet inside, and you write about having trouble sleeping, taking all sorts of stuff to try. Inside, you were breaking apart. I think you write about being in stairwells of hospitals where they know to leave you alone. So talk about, there was the public Marisa, but then there's the private internal that people didn't know that was there. So just talk about the overwhelming, almost tsunami tidal wave of grief that hit you that other people probably didn't really see.
Yeah, when we took my mom off treatment, I wrote her a letter, and I promised her that like I supported her decision and I was going to be just fine. Like we were the ones having honest conversations about the fact that her time was limited, and what did she want? Where did she want to die? What did she want for her funeral? We had that kind of relationship. And I felt like I needed her to know that I was going to be okay. And I made the mistake as a younger person, thinking that okay meant going back to work, going back to life, and just like going back to being who I consider myself to be. But what I didn't realize is the moment you lose someone you love, like someone who you consider to be one of yours, whether it's a parent or a spouse or a child or a best friend, you stop being the same person that you were before. Like I didn't understand that at 5:37 p.m. on February 28th, when my mom died, that like there was a part of me, for better or worse, that died with her. And now what I needed to do to be okay was figure out like, who am I in this world without this woman who was both my mom, but also she was someone who I had oriented my life around to some extent since I was 13 years old. So like there was a lot of my identity kind of tied up in her as well. And because I thought that the grief would be easier because I was prepared and organized, because I like believed that I was strong and I'd already been through a bunch in life. And so I didn't think it would be as hard as it was going to be. And then because I promised her I would be fine, but didn't really know what that meant, I forced myself to go back to work 2 weeks after we buried her, to continue running a nonprofit on the side while I worked on Wall Street during the height of the financial crisis, to try to like be okay, even though I very much was not okay. And because I had all of these messed up ideas about grief and loss and like who I was and what I was meant to do, I didn't feel comfortable sharing with anyone else, like just how bad it was. But literally, every day I was able to like get myself up, get myself dressed. Like sometimes it was hard and only on 3 or 4 hours sleep, but like I could get myself ready for work, get on the subway. But the second that I started to leave the subway stop at Wall Street in New York City and climb the stairs to like head to my office, I would start having a debilitating panic attack. I could make it to the basement of the investment bank where I worked, and that's where I would spend the first, I don't know, like 45 minutes, hour. Like I truly don't know how much time I spent down there. And there was one friend who like knew about my morning routine, the only other woman in the entire banking department. And she would come down whenever I emailed her, when I was like starting to put myself back together. And she would bring me a Xanax from my desk, a cookie, and a soy latte. And that was my routine for months. And I just was like, oh, I guess this is what it's supposed to be. I don't really know what else to do. And not asking for help. Like that's what I did until it stopped. And so I think it's really important when you're dealing with grief or some other deeply challenging emotion or experience, to give yourself permission to just be with the feelings and to find your way through it and to ask for help. Because you can't do this stuff on your own. Like healing is a very individual experience, and your grief is very much yours alone, but that doesn't mean you have to do it all alone. And as supportive as my community of friends and family were at the time, like I just didn't feel comfortable opening up to how bad it was because I thought that was wrong.
I mean, that's so profound and so sad, but so real for, everybody that's been through grief. Just, I want to kind of pivot a bit because you're talking about some of the themes in your book. And I love the title of your book, Grief is Love. Just talk about what you mean by that, because there's some profound truth. And before I let you answer that question, one of the sad and good things about tragedy is, you can learn profound wisdom. It's not a wisdom that you want. You don't want to learn wisdom this way. It's like, please, can you give it to me some other way? But for whatever reason, the way the universe, God, however you view it, not everybody does, but there's the opportunity to learn profound wisdom through tragedy. And you certainly have, from my perspective, whether you wanted to or not, you have, but so talk about grief is love, because there's a profound concept behind that title.
Yeah. So for me, the title and the whole experience of writing the book was actually born from another loss. After years of infertility and IVF and egg donors and doing literally everything in my power to like get pregnant and sustain a pregnancy, including letting an acupuncturist electrocute my uterus. Um,
Mm.
my husband and I lost the pregnancy, a few weeks later. And I am a practical and progressive woman. So it wasn't even for me about the pregnancy itself, but it was more about the hope for our future life as parents and the hope that we held for that child, like having that taken away. And this was at the end of a years long process. Like this was the last chance, the last opportunity. Like this is where everybody was placing their bet, and it didn't work out. And when it didn't work out, I was both devastated that it didn't work out. I was also like physically very sick from the fact that it didn't work out. And all I wanted was my mom. And at that point, she'd been dead for almost 12 years. And I realized then, I was like, I am definitely not over this. Like I never really understood what that whole getting over it thing meant, but I was like, I'm clearly not over it. Like I wish my mom were here to like help me figure out what to do to help me feel better, like to take care of me. And she's not, and it sucks. And then a couple months after that loss, when I was still dealing with both the physical and the emotional consequences, we all found ourselves living in the midst of a pandemic. And the only thing I could do was just like write my way through it. And as I realized that there's no point in trying to get over it, and what you actually have to do is learn to live with your losses, I I started to understand like that is true because of the love that we share with people. Like if somebody dies who you have no connection to at all, you are probably going to feel bad, or maybe feel bad for like their family. Like you're going to feel a little something if you are a person with some degree of empathy, right? But it's not the kind of thing that's going to continue to come up for you, that you're going to have to continually deal with. Whereas when you lose someone who you share an unconditional love relationship with, like your brain is forced to figure out what it looks like to exist in the world without them. And as a part of that, you need to reconcile all of this love that you shared with someone who's no longer here. And it's like, what does that look like? How does that work? And I finally realized that the pain that we feel is because fundamentally, like that grief is inextricably connected to the love that you share with someone. And what I realized is, love is both feeling and action. And I started thinking about this a lot as I became a new mom when I was wrapping up this book. And it's like, okay, if love is both feeling and action, we grieve because these people that we love so much, that we shared so much of our life with, are no longer here because they can no longer act on that love. And that hurts. Like that sucks, especially when other losses take place or things happen in life where you really want them there. But I think you can continue to both feel their love for you and continue to hold love for them. Like just because my mom's not here, like I'm not going to forget about her. Like there are always going to be things that make me think about her, or that make me miss her, or where I'm forced to acknowledge the absence. And so for me, fundamentally, I came out with, oh yeah, like grief is just another form of love. And unfortunately, it's often a painful form of love.
One of the things that you state, and there's so many profound statements, truths that you say. One that really struck me in particular is you say, grief, like love, is also limitless, which means we have to find a way to live with it. The profound truth is not like, okay, I'm a strong person, I'll take 3 to 6 months and then we'll be done. I'm going to find a way through it. And obviously, we're very different, but both my parents, well, my mother was extremely driven in a lot of ways. So I have, I think, some of her perseverance, but left to my own devices, I'd have a little bit of that mentality, is that, I'm a strong-willed person with perseverance. I'm pretty, if not very well aware of my feelings, faults, all the rest. I'm pretty self-aware. Okay, I have the intelligence, like Oxford, Harvard Business School. I have the capacity, the intelligence, and the emotional understanding. I have what I need. Let's let's power through this. Let's make it go away because, talking about it does help, no question. But it's not like it makes it go away. It makes it easy to live with. But it's so profound that, it's limitless. It doesn't go away. Maybe it's obvious, but to me, that's a revelation for most people that goes through grief. It's like, oh, really? Oh, you mean it's okay to have days when something triggers me? And it's like, I lost my dad who was in his late 80s when he died because I was from marriage number 3. And my dad died in early 87. That's like 30 plus years ago. Yeah. I still miss him. I will have dreams occasionally where he's in it. A little bit like you, in a sense. I met my wife, who's American, in Australia a year after he died. My kids have never known, they're like 31 down to 24. My kids have never known their grandfather. And he wasn't perfect, but do I grieve the fact that my wife never met him? And and it's not like he died of prostate cancer when you're late 80s. I don't mean to be callous, but something's going to happen. It's just, it wasn't like your mother at 49, but all that's to say is that's 30 plus years and I still grieve. I still dream occasionally, have moments. And so it's just jump in. It's so profound. Please go ahead, Gary.
If I can, because I've been looking for the right time to say this to you, Marisa. My mother passed away in 1994, and she was only 63, which now that I'm 57, I can put only in front of 63. Yes. I couldn't then, but that was 28 years ago. And working on the preparation for this show, and studying your story and the insights that you've gained about how grief doesn't end, just like love doesn't end. You may be able to tell if anybody is watching this on YouTube or you see a clip. You've been around for 140 episodes. Listener, that I like to wear hats. I'm a little fancy in terms of, but I also like to wear rings a lot. The problem is I can't wear rings on the show because they clack on my microphone. But today, right before we got on this call, I have behind me a bookcase. This is going somewhere, trust me.
I have
behind me a bookcase, and I have things stored in there. And one of the things I have stored in there is what you'll see here on my finger. That is a dollar bill that was folded into a ring. And it was folded into a ring more than almost 40 years ago by my mother.
Aww.
And as I was preparing this area to go with this show to interview you, I was hit with a wave of grief. We talked to another guest last week about grief doesn't come necessarily in a linear process. They're waves, and they can come when you don't expect them. And I was hit with this wave of grief about missing my mom. And I thought, you know what? I'm talking to Marisa Renee Lee today about the loss of her mother. I'm going to bring my mom with me to this episode.
I love it.
And that grief that I felt in that loss, and I'm not going to lie and say that every day I think about her. I don't. Weeks, months, can go by where I don't. But in that moment, I did. In that moment, the love washed over me, just as the grief washed over me. And I thought, I'm going to honor her in this way. And I just want to thank you for both being honest about your grief experience and the lessons that you've learned, but then also inspiring me to bring mom to the show today. So thank you for that.
I love it. Gary, I brought my mom too. I know, I realize you guys probably can't see this, but there's in there.
Oh, wow.
Our last Christmases. Yeah. I'm with you.
Wow. Yeah. You know what? And thank you for sharing that, Gary. I mean, what I love about what you're saying, and you talk about this in the early chapters, is just the permission to grieve your way. Everybody's different. Yes. Everybody processes grief differently. And it's, we often think that we need to be caring for others. You spend a good part of your life, it's not about me, it's about others. And, you write later about you've got to actually care for yourself. A lot of studies these days say, like in the airplane, you've got young kids.
Yeah.
Put the oxygen mask on yourself first. If you can't care for yourself, and this is in the later chapters, you won't be able to care, in your case, for your husband and your son, or you won't be a good friend or anything. I mean, so if you care for other people, you should care for yourself. So that's in the later chapters. But I love just this permission to grieve, and it's not, there's a couple of different chapters melded into this, but it's not weakness to say, hey, I'm not doing well.
No,
it's actually, to me, it's human. To me, it's a sign of strength. It's a sign of courage. It's being brave enough to say, I'm not okay. It's not weakness. Yeah. It's profound strength. It just talk about some of these lessons that listeners can hopefully understand. Grieve your way. You have a permission to grieve. It's not weakness. It's courage to actually grieve and find a safe place, a safe person where you can say, hey, you know what? I'm not doing okay. I'm just doing terrible.
Yeah,
so
I think in American and sort of generally in Western culture, we glorify all things positive. I'm good, I'm okay, turn your lemons into lemonade, blah, blah, blah. But if you look at the research, as human beings, we are born with, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but 5 or 6 innate emotions. And half of them are things that we have come to judge and categorize as negative. And it's how can it actually be negative if we were all born to feel these different things and to feel in this way sometimes? It is normal to be sad. And I will tell you, being the parent of a baby right now has been a great reminder of sort of the fullness of the human experience and the full spectrum of emotions that we should all be expected to experience. I'm sick of this, sort of pull yourself up by your emotional bootstraps mentality. And instead, I want to see people giving themselves permission to just be human, to have a hard time, to have a bad day, to not feel like your best, most perfect Instagram worthy self 24/7. It's just that's just not real. You can't live like that. And so I wanted to dig into a bunch of those themes in the book, but just to go back to what you said, a few things. Permission to grieve felt really important to me because when I sat down to write the second version of this book, because the first version was one that I knew wasn't right. And I realized one day that it wasn't right because it focused too much on grief and less on healing. I wanted to write a book that got at what has enabled me to live this full, hot pink, joyful life in the midst of multiple significant losses. And one of the first ingredients, and it is the first chapter in the book and also the longest chapter in the book, is permission. I finally had to stop trying to live up to either my own warped expectations or other people's expectations around my personal emotional well-being and give myself permission to feel however I feel each day about my mom, about the pregnancy loss. When I was writing the book, there was also a lot of grief around going through the adoption process. That was just a really hard, stressful thing. So once I started giving myself permission, it felt a lot easier to identify what are the things that can help me through this difficult time. Whether it's talking about and giving some voice to my feelings, or, I find writing to be very therapeutic, or going to a counselor, or, just going for a walk or doing a meditation, I felt like I couldn't get at what's going to help me get through the really hard moments without first giving myself permission to feel and acknowledge the hard moments. And then one of the other things that I want to make sure people understand, we talked about how grief is limitless, how there is no timeline. And one of the things that I find a lot of people get really stuck on around grief is the idea of the 5 stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, brilliant woman, brilliant writer, researcher, but she herself makes very clear that book and her 5 stages, that wasn't written for you or me or for you, Gary. That was written for people who were dying themselves. And so we have taken this dated framework that wasn't even supposed to apply to bereaved people, and we have applied it to bereaved people in a way that I think in more cases than not causes harm. Because when you hear something like stages, you think that there are these sequential steps like AA or the developmental milestones that we look for in our little children that you're supposed to go through in this very ordered way. And when that doesn't happen, you're like, oh, I messed up. Like now I feel like shit. And it turns out I'm grieving wrong. Like, no, that's not true. Like, that's just absolutely not true. So no timelines, no stages. Please give yourself permission. And I think that while I'm very much opposed to the whole taking lemons and turning them into lemonade, I do think that grief and joy can exist simultaneously. If you are honest and open about what you're experiencing, I think that does sometimes create space for joy. And I'm not talking about the like overwhelming sense of happiness that maybe you had on your wedding day or when your child was born or whatever, but even just a moment where, you look outside and the sun is shining and you feel a little bit better for 90 seconds. And so I want to make sure that people honor the fullness of their experience, which can include some joy or some laughter, even when you're deep in grief.
And we're going to, I think, touch on this here in a bit about joy and grief. But one of the things, you write a lot of profound things, and you quote an author, Glennon Doyle, that says we can do hard things, but when it comes to grief, especially early on, instead of doing hard things, we need to commit to being with hard feelings. And so the image I had in my mind, and it might have been one of our other guests that used this phrase, is rather than run away from the storm of grief, head straight for it.
Yeah, you can't avoid it.
Head straight to the feelings. I know for me, again, being a reflective person, there are times because of, some of the things we've all been through stuff, I'll feel like fearful or not quite demobilized, but somewhat, and I'm like, okay, today's a fairly good day. It doesn't quite make sense. I don't quite understand why I'm feeling this way. But because I'm reflective, it's like, okay, I have to understand it. And so if it's personal, obviously, typically, I have done, counseling years ago, but, these days I'll talk to my wife and say, okay, she knows me well after 30 years. I'm fearful and I don't understand why. And we'll talk about it. And eventually, 9 times out of 10, it will come out and I'll figure it out. So, okay, now I understand. It doesn't mean it just goes, but it helps to understand it. And being a person of faith, obviously part of my go-to self-treatment will be prayer and maybe some scripture reading. Everybody has their own truth, their own methods that work for them. Yes, I also do walks in the woods or listen to some beautiful music. I mean, all of the above. But I feel like heading straight into the storm and understanding I'm feeling bad, but why am I feeling bad?
Yeah.
And again, this is not my wisdom. There are others. Feelings are not right or wrong. They just are. So if you have times in which you're resentful towards your mother, father, then you've got a sister that is bipolar. I mean, there's probably, God, the universe, whatever, about pregnancy. There's probably a list of people or entities you could be angry about. And that's not right or wrong. It is. Does that make sense? It's just 100%. head into the storm and don't criticize yourself for having feelings, whether they're right or wrong. They're your feelings, your truth. Yeah. Don't ignore it, even if it's anger and resentment.
Don't ignore it and don't be quick to judge it. I think we are often like you said, you're like, oh, it's a beautiful day. Everything's going good. Like, why don't I feel quite right? And sometimes it takes time even just to get at what does it mean that I'm not feeling quite right? Like what on a deeper level, like, is it sadness? Is it anger? Am I just feeling a little bit out of sorts? Because once you get at what you're really experiencing, I think to your point, it makes it easier to then say, oh, maybe I'm feeling this way because either this thing happened or I've been triggered in some sort of grief thing, then you can figure out, if anything, what to do with it. Right. But I do think it starts with sitting with it, facing it, and figuring out what those feelings are and naming them.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom here. I mean, just a couple of the thoughts, being vulnerable for a purpose, so to speak, or just expressing the fact you're not doing well. One of the things you obviously write about, certainly by implication, is you have to choose wisely. There can be some family members who we love very dearly who want to fix us. And they'll be like, oh, thanks so much for sharing, Marisa. You need to do X. Go to counseling, do that. No, counseling's not bad, but it's like, here's a 5-point plan of how to help.
Or another common one is the like, but you have this and you have this and you have that. So like, don't be sad. Don't be whatever.
Well, you have a wonderful husband and a baby. You should be full of joy.
You should be fine.
You do meaningful. So you want to find people that are not just a safe place, but a wise place. The safe and wise people will sit there and listen. They might say, I'm sorry. They will be very short on answers and long on listening and empathy. And not everybody's wired that way. And if that's family members, great. If it's not, nothing against family, but find people that will listen and not try and fix you, right?
Yeah. I mean, figure out who your crew is. Like, who are the 2 people, maybe 3, who you can text when you're going through it, who aren't going to jump to solutions and are just going to meet you with compassion and empathy.
Indeed. You talk also about grace, grace for yourself and grace for others, and that's not easy. I know, you write in the book about a very good friend, I think in college, who was playing for the Irish women's soccer team and had a big match. And it's like, she's thinking, this is like one of the highlights of my career. You're thinking, this is my best friend. You need to be here. And it took a while to get through that one and different perspectives. But, just having grace for you, for others, and forgiveness, sometimes people have different. And so, I mean, that's important, grace for yourself and other people. And 100%. People talk about agree to disagree, but some people you might think, well, I would never do that. If I was on X soccer team, I'd drop it in a heartbeat. And you might think, well, I feel that's wrong. And it may or may not be, but talk a bit about grace for yourself and grace for others, because it's easy for anger to just multiply and start getting angry at other people, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, I think when you're hurting, it is hard to leave room for other people's imperfections of any kind. And when you're hurting and you have expectations around how people in your life are supposed to support you, and then they don't, it's really hard. And I think in some instances, frankly, proper boundaries may make the most sense. If it's someone who's not interested in apologizing or trying to kind of, meet you halfway and show you the care and love and support that you need, you probably just need to put up some boundaries and, go find a different friend or family member to support you. But when people are on your team and like really want to be there for you, and bearing in mind the understanding that, as far as I can tell at this point, like, grief doesn't go away. So you want to keep people in your life who really want to be there for you for the long haul, because it's going to keep coming up. You're going to continue to be triggered by it. I just think it's really important to be willing to forgive and to extend grace, because we're all human, and most days we're all doing the best we can. And then I think it's equally important for you to extend grace to yourself. When you are grieving, grief takes over your body and your mind. And I'm not just saying that, like, there is scientific research that shows the direct impact that grief has on your brain. And that impact makes it hard for you to do the things that you've become accustomed to do, or in some cases for you to do things the way that you're used to doing them, because you're not yourself when grief has taken over. I just think that grace it really is a two-way street. And I want people to think about grace as a key ingredient in living with loss.
That's so well said. I know as we're getting to the summary stage, I mean, a number of things you've said is so profound. Is you don't get over loss. You don't get over typically grief, at least not from my perspective. You learn to balance grief and love, and living with grief and living with your family and career. It's all different strands in the same stream, if you will. It's just part of life. There will be things that trigger you, whether it's, in my case, a loss of a family business, a loss of my dad, loss of my mother. There will be things that come up, and it could be simple as I remember years ago, it's probably not a great example, but when my kids were small, they know I grew up obviously very wealthy, and when we had Christmas trees, we had staff to put stuff up, the Christmas ornaments on. Sounds kind of bizarre. And I remember my kids were small, and they said, well, Daddy, that's so sad that you didn't do it as a family. And when they said that, I was just struck by like a wave of grief and loss, because it's like, you know what, you're right. I would have loved to grow up in a family where you're doing it. Most people take that for granted. Now, that was part of, gosh, I guess I grew up different. In some ways, there's a loss of what others had, the simple Christmases rather than the stuff. That's a small example, but there will be things that trigger us for some reason, out of the blue.
Yep.
And that's just part of life. And what you're saying, and I want listeners to hear this, don't expect to get over loss. You might learn to live with it better. I don't know, but you learn to live with it. And does that make sense? Because sometimes
100%.
people think, if I read the right books, have the right counselor, you know what? And you talk about this, if I just found the right counselor, he or she could really, flip the switch, and I would be, praise God, I'm healed. No grief. That's awesome.
I mean, unfortunately, I just don't think that's how, I'm almost 15 years into my journey, following the loss of my mom. And the research that I looked at about not just how grief impacts your brain, but also how love imprints on your brain. You're never going to forget about your father, or about the fact that, you had this family business that is no longer a family business. You're never going to forget about those things. And because they stay stored, and because you're never going to forget, there are always going to be moments, some joyful, some painful, that trigger you. It's just, it's baked into who you are. And there's nothing wrong with that.
This is a perfect time to listen to the captain, who's just turned on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating that we have begun our descent to end this very fascinating and helpful discussion and this cap on our series, Gaining from Loss. I want to do a couple things, Marisa, before I let Warwick ask the last question. First thing, very important, how can listeners find you and find out more about you online? Where can they get their hands on your book and learn more about what it is that you do?
So you can buy Grief is Love pretty much anywhere books are sold: Amazon, Target, local booksellers, Barnes and Noble, etc. You can find me. I'm Marisa Renee Lee on all social platforms, and that's also my website. So please do follow along on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And I hope that you will consider buying the book. It's not perfect. I don't know that there is a perfect book on grief, but I'm really trying to normalize the experience of grief and loss for people, and ensure that everyone has access to the things they need to heal from loss.
And that's a perfect segue into the second thing I want to do here, because as I've said a couple of times, this is the last episode with a guest of our series, Gaining from Loss. And there's something that I found that you wrote for Vogue magazine last October called How I Learned to Find Joy During Times of Grief. And the sentence that you have that sort of sets up the 5 areas that you talk about, I think is a great capstone for this series, because you say this: as I've worked to manage my grief over the years, here's how I've learned to cultivate joy. I would edit that a little bit at the end of this series for the context of this series to say, as I've worked to manage my loss over the years, here's how I've learned to, I'll take out cultivate joy, and with your permission, slide in create gain from the loss.
Yes.
But here are the 5 things. And I want to do this. I've never done this before. So hopefully, but you've got the kind of mind I think is going to make this work out really well. I want to play this as sort of a fast money on a game show thing, where I'm going to tell you, right? I'm going to say, here's the first point that you said about this idea of how you manage grief over the years to find joy. You have 5 points, and I don't want you to have to dive too deeply into it, but the first couple thoughts that come to your head when I say, here's the first thing you wrote that you do that. And the first thing that you wrote to cultivate joy through grief and through loss, the first thing you wrote is identify what you need and take it. A couple sentences on what you meant by that.
Yes. Honestly, this gets back to what Warwick was saying about feelings. Figure out what you're feeling and then figure out what you need in order to access joy. It may be that today is just a day for you to sit with some sad feelings and let them wash over you so that tomorrow can be more joyful. Or it may be something more specific, like going to counseling. But whatever it is, figure it out and take it, because you deserve to be happy.
Excellent. Point 1 wrapped. Point 2, set boundaries and stick to them. Couple sentences on that.
Yeah, this is a big one. I think especially with the approaching holiday season here in the States, I think it's really important, if you're having a hard time, to not force yourself into a bunch of shoulds, for lack of a more technical term, like, oh, I should do this work thing. I should go to that event. I should celebrate Thanksgiving in this kind of a way, even though I'm pretty sure it's going to make me feel like shit. So get rid of the shoulds and set boundaries around what you are and aren't comfortable doing while you're grieving.
The third point is going to sound like we've culled it from Crucible Leadership, Beyond the Crucible texts, because Warwick uses this exact phrase. It's in the new e-course that we've created. And your third point is to identify an accountability partner. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, that's super important. So I don't know about the two of you, but I am really good at being hard on myself, and also sometimes not so great at doing the things that I know I need to do to care for myself. I preach about it. I talk about it all the time, but it's hard to put into practice when you have a full-time job, a new house, and a new baby. And so I have a couple of girlfriends who we hold each other accountable to do the things that we know we need to do in order to pour into our families and pour into our work. And so figure out who in your crew you can link up with, and just, be text buddies around, what are you doing for yourself today? What are your plans for the weekend? How are you making sure that you're getting the rest and the care that you need?
3/5 of the way through, the fourth point of how you live with joy after loss is celebrate something, period, anything. Talk about that.
So my mom was a big celebrations person. So I'm all about celebrating wins, even if they're teeny tiny ones. So if you're having a hard time and today you manage to both get out of bed and brush your teeth, feel free to celebrate that. It's okay. Give yourself a pat on the back.
Awesome. And one of the things that you may celebrate, because I picked this up in some of the research, you love The Godfather. So do I. So if we ever meet, we have to watch, eat some cannoli and watch The Godfather. Here's your last point. And I love this point, not only for your story, Lisa, but I'm sorry, Lisa.
That's my
I'm going to back
name.
up.
It's okay.
I know. I'm going to back up. Well, okay. I'm not going to back up. I'm just going to say,
it's okay.
Marisa, not Lisa. Wow. Hello, Dr. Freud. That is fast.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I mean,
she came to visit. Yeah.
Well, because I'm talking about her, right? And that's the fifth point. The
Mm.
fifth point here is, and I love this for your story and for our series. Your fifth point is be a Lisa.
Yeah. So for me, be a Lisa is all about giving back. And there is research that points to when we are in service of others, it usually does help our own mental and emotional well-being. So that's when I say be a Lisa, I mean, find something you can do for somebody else.
Excellent. Warwick, I'll let you have the last couple of questions, but that sounds a little bit like what we say at Beyond the Crucible: live a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's so much here. I mean, I guess one amusing point, and then back to your mother. One of the funny things here is you talk about at your mother's funeral, it was, I think that the pastor was, I guess it's a mixed congregation. The pastor was white, and you wanted your mother's favorite hymn, gospel song.
Mm-hmm.
They got this, African-American woman to sing it, and
oh God,
she couldn't sing, and you'll try to be serious because it's your it's the funeral, but yet so talk about that. It's just such a weird moment that you had there.
Well, this gets back to the whole like joy piece. Like my mom's funeral wasn't joyful. Like it was devastating. That was like the final acknowledgement. Like this is what's happening. She's gone. But in that moment, we had a really good laugh, and we still talk about it. And like my grandfather just passed away in September, and we're at the same church, same cemetery. Like everything is the same. So lots of triggers. But one thing that came up for all of us, me, my sister, my cousin, my dad, my godparents, were like, what will we do if that happens again? Like, we're going to have to start laughing. Like, remember how horrible that was? Like, to this day, ever in my life, actually, I've never heard anyone sing so poorly. And it was so funny. And it was like inappropriate to laugh. Like, we're like sitting in the front row as the family. There's my mom's open casket right there. And this woman is on stage, and like, we like couldn't stop laughing. And of course, my grandma's like, you guys need to stop. Like, what are you doing? But then she's like silently snickering as well. Like, it was a mess. And the best, I don't know if this is the best part, but the other funny part of it is there was a woman that I had in mind who I would have loved to hear sing the song, who was a longtime friend of the family, beautiful voice. And I thought she had died. Like, that's why I didn't ask her to do it. And then she shows up at the funeral, and I was like, oh my God. Yeah. So it was a moment of laughter in the midst of a lot of grief.
And sometimes you need to have a laugh amidst the pain. So
exactly.
Just as we kind of sum up here, I love as you talk about, the legacy of your mother and, living her, legacy in a sense. And I also love just the way that, you've managed to use the loss to help so many. And I've found in my own way, and I'm sure you're finding this, as you write about the pain and people say, Marisa, what you've written really helped me. It doesn't make the grief go away, but maybe it makes it a couple degrees more manageable.
Yes.
It's sort of like drops of grace to a person that maybe feel like they're wandering through the desert and looking for an oasis. I've found that it's not necessarily a reason to do it, but it's a byproduct. So
yeah,
just as we summarize here, what would, I often like to ask, what's sort of a word of hope that you would give people? Because maybe today is somebody's worst day or worst year, worst decade. What's a message of hope that you would give to that person?
Well, it's funny that you use the word hope, because I would say, like, choose hope. Like, keep believing that there is something better than the worst pain of grief, because there is. And while we know the grief doesn't go away, it's not the devastating on the floor of an investment bank panic attack situation that it was 15 years ago. Now it's more subtle and less overwhelming. And I have managed to create like a big, full, joyful life in the absence of my mother, while also creating space for her. But I think you can only do that if you are committed to hope, and if you really believe that there is something better than the worst pain that you experience when you lose someone you love.
That sound you've heard, listener, is the plane on the ground. Marisa has landed the plane, and we've landed this series, Gaining from Loss. So thank you, Marisa Renee Lee. Thank you, listeners, for being with us. Warwick and I will be back next week with a wrap-up of all the things we've learned. See you then.